Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder of Movie Karma. We're a nonprofit organization focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation, as well as social impact in Hollywood. And today, really excited to have a couple special guests here in our podcast, Rewriting Hollywood, to talk about their latest project, LYLE Crocodile. It's a new film coming out in theaters October 7th. It's a really fantastic, family-friendly, live-action musical film that stars some incredible talent: Javier Bardem, Constance Wu, and of course Shawn Mendes as the titular character Lyle, which is a singing saltwater crocodile. And really excited today to have two of the kind of creative minds behind this project, Will Speck and Josh Gordon, also known as Speck and Gordon, who co-directed the project and are joining us today to talk about their journey, but also we sort of what inspired them to work on this really fun and I think also kind of in neat ways important film. So Will and Josh, excited to have you on. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. I saw the two of you, been working together for quite a while. For folks who don't know a bit about your journeys, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about some of the origin story here. I understand you met back in college at NYU Tisch School of the Arts, and just started writing together and working together. Can you tell us a little bit about that origin story?
Yeah, I mean, we met back in film school in New York at NYU, and I think we always kind of recognized in each other sort of shared sensibility and kind of shared aesthetic, and we started working together as writers at the beginning, and kind of found our way into the commercial directing business. Did a lot of work, including like all the early Gecko stuff and for Caveman and all of that stuff, and then started directing films. And our first film was Blades of Glory, and since then we've directed a bunch of films and a lot of TV, and kind of always just sort of continue to work together. It's kind of an interesting relationship, never really worked apart. So we're probably the longest working non-brother or sister relationship in Hollywood.
That's really neat. Will, do you want to build on that? I mean, what's that been like for you to have a collaborator for so many years? And what were the early kind of forays into that? Did you just kind of hit it off and you started immediately diving into creative writing and working together?
Yes, it's been great because I've been able to do half the work, which has been what I've aimed for my whole life. No, I mean, it's actually, we talk to other directors all the time that always say how lonely it can be directing, and how it's nice to be able to have some creative partner. And a lot of people find that in their producing partners or their writing partners, and directing they take sort of as its own lane. But I think what Josh and I share is really unique and special. And I think, we just have a lot of respect for each other, and it feels like we're still growing and we're still able to do new things and try different genres out. And there's just a core trust there. So I think it's been really great.
Yeah, and what's been the process like, as you've moved on with your career? You mentioned, Josh, I think you mentioned Blades of Glory, but I imagine, it took some time to get to be able to do, for example, your first feature, and to get to sort of earn the trust of the industry, if you will, to do that. So what were some of those, as you were starting to get the commercials or really starting to get your footing? Maybe Josh, you could talk about what were some of those challenges as you were collaborating together, maybe felt like you were hitting on all cylinders together, but that there was, you were still sort of climbing this career ladder?
Well, I think, when you're starting out as a director specifically, it is hard to gain the trust of the industry, meaning, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of responsibility that they're putting in your hands. And I think we were very lucky in that the commercial industry when we started was very healthy and kind of robust, and you could start essentially small. You could work out your style, you could work out what worked for you on set, and you could honestly work out your kinks. I mean, not everybody's perfect, and you have to kind of figure out how to conduct yourself and how to how to operate in this kind of weird professional environment. And we were able to do that in commercials. And so I think we did that for a couple of years. And by the time we got to direct our first film, it didn't feel like we were like first day on set. I knew what we wanted, and we knew how to fight for what we needed, and we knew also how to kind of compromise when we needed. So those were important lessons I think we learned in the early days of commercials.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I think a lot of folks, or maybe future directors listening to this, might not think of commercials as a route for them, or might not know much about that pathway. I have a number of friends who've done some similar things where they've started in commercials and really sort of honed their craft and did some great work, and then kind of branched out to narrative storytelling or even documentary storytelling. I wonder if either of you could comment on, building on what you just said, Josh, what your advice might be, if you had any, for, maybe a young director or potential director listening to this, about the value of having that commercial experience, and what that gave you in terms of narrative storytelling.
Well, I think it's whether it's commercials or music videos or, frankly, there's so much now that wasn't there when we started, just because the internet is an explosion of opportunity. I have a son right now who just graduated from NYU, and his, the projects that he and his friends are starting to work on are kind of blowing my mind in terms of how many, the proliferation of sort of platforms and things that you can work for. Obviously when you're first starting out, the budgets are extremely low. You're begging and borrowing to get these things made. I think the most important thing is not to turn too much down, like do work. That was what was lucky about commercials, was you can get into your own head. Oh, this has to be the most perfect thing I've ever made, and it represents everything that I want to say as a filmmaker. And those are rare when you're starting out. If you're lucky, they're there. But what's more important is, I think, gaining experience, because with experience, you kind of figure out the types of crews that you want to work for, how you need to ask for things or demand for things. Those are the hardest things, I think, for a director to kind of navigate. And a lot of directors founder when they first do their first features, because they either demand too much or they demand too little. You know what I mean? So I think it's
Right.
really kind of finding what works for you. And the only way you can really find what works for you is, I think, by just doing it,
Right, getting that practical experience, which is so important in the industry, as you said. I wanted to comment or just check in, I guess, on some couple interesting projects that you worked on in the kind of commercial adjacent space, or PSA space, which you received quite a bit of attention for. One was kind of PSA Make Homosexuals Marry with Justin Long and Mike White, back around in the Prop 8 days in California. Which, Josh, wondering if you could talk a little about doing a project like that, because that was, at the time, I imagine, not universally loved, in terms of, you were saying, like, hey, for those of you upset with kind of a quote homosexual lifestyle, like let us folks, get married, or kind of thing. And it sort of had a tongue-in-cheek tone, but it was also, I'm sure, controversial at the time, or there were some folks who was like, saying maybe you shouldn't do this. I wonder, like, what was that experience like, doing that?
I mean, it was kind of a tricky time, because there was sort of a imposing law that was coming down pretty fast and furious. And I remember Josh and we had a very specific window we needed to hit in order to do that and get it out there and try to make a difference with it. And so, in kind of a fun improvisational way, we all jumped in, our agency, the guys that brought it to us, this guy, Chris Beresford Hill, and a couple other people, John Doris, we all partnered up. Josh really polished up the script, I think, based a little bit on my relationship at the time. And we sort of, twisted this idea about, what gay marriage could be in terms of, conventions, and challenging the fun of twisting that. And I think it was met, I think, with some controversy, but I think ultimately, Josh, I think it really got out there and got the message out there in a fun and funny way.
Yeah, we find that comedy, oftentimes can disarm even critics, because ultimately you can recognize the point of that was every marriage is the same regardless of who you are. So it's equally miserable for everybody. So
Yeah,
that
I
was
can
the sort
attest
of
to
that
that.
was the comedic premise of it. So I think anybody ultimately, even if they're angry about it, can recognize the truth of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting where we've come. I mean, to Will's point, I mean, I've been in a boring, same-sex marriage for I think 7-8 years now, and I think it's really, and we got married, my husband and I, right around, when the Supreme Court said this was the law of the land in Illinois, and then nationally, and so it's interesting to see too where that movement has gone, right? Where now you have sort of another generation of queer LGBTQ plus folks saying, "Hey, we don't want to get married. Like, why are you doing this kind of heteronormative thing, right?" So it's interesting to
Right.
rewatch it now and how
Yeah.
that shifted.
Everything is quaint with time.
Yeah, exactly. What was the big deal kind of thing. You also did a project called World's Biggest Asshole, starring Thomas Jane and the voice of Will Arnett, who I know you've collaborated with quite a bit. I just want to quickly ask about that. It was real impactful project on some important issues, and also won quite a few awards, I understand, with as a sponsor, Donate Life America. I wonder if you just comment on just doing projects like that, or what that experience was like.
Yeah, I mean, that was another project that was brought to us by the agency that we had done all of the Geico work with, including the Caveman and the Gecko years before. And it's a pro bono job. We as we continued to work in film and TV, we would always go back to the commercial industry because we love it, and we have a company that produces commercials. And what we found great kind of creative nourishment in was doing things like PSAs. A, they make a big difference, and B, you're like afforded a lot of creative freedom in doing them. And this was for a client called Donate Life. One of the problems they faced was that young men are the most sort of unfortunately likely to die young, and are the lowest group to ever tick the box of donating organs. And so they had this big problem of reaching out to younger men. And they had very kind of, before this, very saccharine kind of advertising that just tried to appeal to your general goodness, which wasn't really working. And so they came up with this idea that, even if you're the world's biggest asshole, if you're the worst person in the world, if you just tick this box, at the end, you can actually sort of be a good person and leave the world with some pride. So we wrote this very, very dark spot about a guy who's just really the worst person you've ever met. And it sort of exhibits that behavior. And that was just us digging into like, okay, what's really bad, awful behavior. And then at the end, he affects all these incredible people's lives. And we did it, shot it over about 3 days, pretty much all favors, and everybody did it for free. And, it ended up reaching almost 100 million people and changing, I think they said something like 500,000 young men signed up that wouldn't have otherwise signed up.
Wow.
And so it was ultimately this incredibly, and they said something like each person that signs up can save at least 2 or 3 lives. So we sort of had this amazing experience on it of being like, wow, this may be the most important thing we've ever done. And it was just a 2 or 3 day little free job. But those kind of jobs, when you get them, are amazing.
And what do you take away from that, Josh? I mean, other than obviously just the impact that you said you can have with something seemingly maybe minor or just like a short spot. But I wonder, like, yeah, I think that says a lot about the impact of story, and the impact of comedy and
I think there was a basic truth to the premise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was everybody sort of enjoys bad behavior on some level when you see it. And so it was able to suck you in with humor and darkness, and it didn't pull any punches. That, I think, was why it hit so many people, because it was this very strong flavor that you don't normally see, because his behavior was truly reprehensible. And so it sort of sucked you in, and then the heart kind of came in at the end instead of leading with the heart. So I think for Will and I, this sort of, we're cynical guys in our base sensibility, but underneath we're sort of soft, and we have heart. So there's something always about that combination of those two flavors together that I think are potent when they work.
It's a good segue to LYLE Crocodile. I had a chance to screen the film. It's a really heartwarming, it's funny, it's fun. I think, obviously, I remember hearing, of course, of the story, the famous children's story, which is based on the book, I think, published in 1965 by Bernard Weber, of this, singing saltwater crocodile. So a lot of folks listening to this, I'm sure, may remember it from their childhood, or maybe teaching their own, reading it to their own kids. But tell us a little bit, either of you, if you would, or both of you, about this, getting attached to this project and how it fit or was an expansion of kind of the sensibilities of the types of work that you look for.
I think it was something that Josh and I always were attracted to, because we both loved the books when we were kids, and we both read the books to our kids. I think it was something that stayed with us because it was during a time with children's literature where there were sort of, a little bit of melancholy, a little bit of deeper, darker themes. And I think the idea about finding your voice, a little bit of self-acceptance, kind of the wish fulfillment that somebody could come in an unlikely way and change your life, were all of these sort of messages that Josh and I were kind of imposing on these, 26 or so pages of this kid's book. And I think it didn't really disappoint when we put it to filming it as an adaptation. And I think wanting to do a musical was something Josh and I have always wanted to do. And it was a big challenge, but it was one that we just absolutely loved every minute of. So I think, all in all, a really positive sort of step for us, and something completely different. But as you said, we tried to bring some comedy into it and some heart into it, and a little bit of undercurrent of darkness in Javier's character, just because I think that's sort of the elements of our work that seemed to be always
Right. Yeah, and Josh, and I don't want to build on that, but I mean, there's certainly a lot of themes here, around courage, around friendship, open-mindedness, but I think also just, the sort of the main, young kid in the character in the film, the main character there, he, other than Lyle, he sort of is struggling with, I think, anxiety and sort of living in a new community and new school and all those things that a lot of kids, probably anyone can relate to, but I think certainly as a young person, just sort of navigating those spaces when you feel different, can be challenging. So like, what were, some of those themes beyond what Will just mentioned, Josh, that you wanted to really explore?
I think also, everything Will talked about was why we were drawn to it. And I think what we discovered with Will Davies, the writer, as we were adapting it, was that the story is also really about inclusion on a certain level. It's about not fearing the other, and the book is really about a crocodile who is terrifying on the surface, and people don't understand him. And ultimately, by loving him, they unlock this beautiful soul, and that soul kind of makes them all richer and better. So I think that was something that was a theme that was coursing through the book. Like Will said, a lot of these books in the 60s treated children like adults, but gave them a more sophisticated version of a child's book than, like, Run with Dick and Jane or something. It dealt with things like melancholy and loneliness and things like that. So I think that theme of inclusion was important to us.
Yeah, it certainly was very present in both, both the stories that you based this film on, but also the film itself. And that's an important theme, obviously, right now, with most, so much of the division that we see in our politics, in our society. Wonder, Will or Josh, if you want to talk a little bit about, where you think this is landing in terms of audiences. I know it hasn't been fully released yet, but in terms of the impact it can have on, or do you think it would have an impact on just, to Josh's point, that the ability to be more open-minded, to, to extend a hand to someone who's, or something that's different from you. What are some of the impacts you think this could have more broadly, if any, in some of those themes?
I think, look, you always hope that your work can speak to people, and that people impose some level of their own experiences and the potential for change into what you present to them. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
Sometimes it's more pointed, like Josh was talking about in our PSA work. But I think here, look, there's a lot of joy in the movie, and there's a lot of, elements of, we hope, in a kind of a light way, about being other, about being different, and about having a chance to transition out of that energy by, the relationship that they have with this crocodile. And I think if some people pull that, if some kids identify, you know what, I've felt a little lonely, or it's not been fun for me to be in a new place, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel, in an easygoing way, it feels like that would be great to see that there's some impact. I don't know, Josh, if you want to build on that, but
Yeah, no, I think, look, with children's literature, and also with films that are aimed at a younger audience, you want the themes to kind of be absorbed in a light way, right? You don't want to hit them over the head. And I think, look, I was made a more inclusive, better person by watching Sesame Street. You know what I mean? So I think when
Same.
you make these things, I think they do affect kids kind of over the long term, and parents. But I think we also wanted to make a movie at this time that's joyous, because there's so much darkness right now in the world, and there's, especially kids are going through so much with COVID and with all the stuff that's going on in the world, that the nice thing about going to a movie theater, sitting in a darkened theater, being transported into kind of a magical world, this time a musical starring a crocodile. And if those themes can kind of work on your mind in the background, then to us, it's a win-win. It's kind of a great, everything works.
Yeah, it's a beautiful message, and I think that's where the social impact lies, and the inclusion lies, as you said. Couple questions before we wrap here. For the Shawn Mendes fans listening, and I'm one of them. What was it like working with him on this? And he brings a lot of life and joy to this. We don't see his face exactly, but as Lyle, he brings, I think, just a great spirit of optimism and fun and acceptance and love. I mean, there's just so much, I think, that he brought to this, and I was curious what that process was like, or if you want to comment on what it was like working with this incredible ensemble too that you worked with.
I mean, Sean was incredible. I mean, he was sort of our first choice. We were, lucky enough that he related actually to the character quite a bit. He when we first talked to him, he talked about, his own, anxiety about performing, and the need to be loved and accepted, and that he felt sometimes like a big kind of overgrown sort of lug, because he's very tall. And so he sort of said, I kind of relate to this character. And what was surprising was, he's obviously an incredible, pop artist. He's an incredible singer. But he's quite a good actor. Like, he came in and was able to interpret as an actor would these songs, and Pasek and Paul, who are composers, write absolutely beautiful songs, like, the songs from La La Land and Greatest Showman. But they're hard songs for people to sing, because they're very complex musically. And Sean was able to really excel at that. And that was an incredible sort of thing to watch him go through in the studio, was that first kind of acting experience. And in terms of the other actors, I mean, we really got our first choice everywhere. I mean, Javier Bardem is one of the greatest actors in the world, obviously, and he brings a kind of depth and gravitas to that character that was really something we were hoping for, and really exceeded our expectations. Constance Wu, who came out of musical theater before she became, a film actress, is amazing in her musical sequences. So we really, and then Winslow, and who plays the young boy. I mean, everybody across the board really sort of was our first choice, and gave us everything we wanted.
Yeah, it really wasn't. I felt like an ensemble performance that folks can enjoy in a really fun musical way, and also just a kind of meaningful way as well. And on that point about Sean, I mean, it's really interesting to see his comments lately on mental health, and his sort of openness about that. And to your point, Josh, it seemed like this kind of character would connect to him, given what he's experiencing.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess the last question here is just sort of what's coming up next for both of you. I saw you're attached to do some really exciting stuff. Executive producing an upcoming A24 thriller, Silver Lake, with Zachary Quinto, and doing some really neat stuff upcoming. So I wonder if either of you wanted to talk about what kind of projects you're looking for now, or where you want to head in your career next.
Well, we're sort of continuing to look to expand. We're looking to do another musical with Pasek and Paul, and we've got kind of a diverse slate of projects, including an upcoming sci-fi film called Distant, which is going to be released by Universal and Amblin in next year, which is starring Anthony Ramos and is a sci-fi thriller set 100 years to the future on a distant planet. But our first thing that we're doing right now is a TV show for Marvel and Hulu, which is the second season of our show, Hit Monkey, which stars Jason Sudeikis and Olivia Munn, which is a sort of R-rated animated adult sort of show on Hulu. So
it's exciting. I guess before I let you go on that point, just in terms of what's upcoming, we asked all of our guests this last question around just inclusion, diversity, equity, where the industry's heading. And you guys, we touched on this a lot today with some of your prior work. You've certainly, I think, been vanguards in some of these respects. But how do you see that? How do you see that where the industry's heading on this question of more representation, more equity, more inclusion in terms of both in front of the camera, which we definitely see in LYLE, Crocodile, but also behind it. And we'll talk with you what about if those values are important to you, how you try to live those out in your projects.
I mean, it's a great question, and they're very important to us. I think inclusivity and course correction is still happening in Hollywood, and it should continue to happen. I think as much as there's an intentionality to make sure that you're challenging the assumption, we often find ourselves, and the two of us visually are in this space, even though I'm a queer filmmaker, we find ourselves constantly in rooms with white men over 50, and it's just because of what people have had the opportunity to do and to be trained for, and where their expertise lies. But I think there's a diversity inclusion program at our commercial production company in terms of trying to hire and bring up production assistants and people in positions of learning, and having mentors advocate, find roles for advocacy. So I think we're just, we're learning and listening and trying to continue to do what I think all of Hollywood's doing, which is to kind of right the ship. We embrace it and celebrate it.
And I think it's more important. Look, I mean, obviously, inclusion in front of the camera is important, but inclusion behind the camera is the thing that will actually change things. So I think that's where people need to put their focus. People of power, people that can hire people, and people that can choose the projects that get made, because that's ultimately what changes Hollywood, I think.
Yeah, I love that, and we'd be happy to talk offline about working together on that. It's great that you have initiatives there, and all for mentorship and apprenticeship and all the pathways that we can open up. So, Will, Josh, thanks again.
Thank you.